There's a particular kind of silence that exists in the hour before dawn in a place like Dunmore. Not the silence of emptiness. Not the silence of a city holding its breath between sirens. This was the silence of things that had been alive for centuries: stone walls, crooked fences, fields that had swallowed the footsteps of 10 generations and asked for nothing back. It was a silence so full it pressed against your ears like warm water. Like it was trying to tell you something. Thomas Aldrich had been listening to that silence for 31 years. He just never understood what it was saying. I want to tell you something about Thomas before I tell you what happened to him, because people always get the ending before they understand the beginning, and then, the ending means nothing. Thomas was not a special man. I say that with respect, I mean it in the truest way. He was the kind of man who existed so comfortably in the fabric of ordinary life that you wouldn't notice him missing until the whole cloth started to unravel. He was medium height. Brown hair that went a little too long before he remembered to cut it. He had hands that were rough from the fields and a laugh that was just a little too loud for small rooms. He drank his tea too strong and forgot to return borrowed tools, and sometimes, in the evening, he'd stand at the edge of his back field and stare at the hills for so long that his border collie, Bramble, would sit beside him and stare too, not at anything in particular, just in solidarity. He was 31 years old and he had never lived anywhere except Dunmore. He had never wanted to. That was the thing. That was always the thing. Dunmore was not a village you'd find on the front of a travel magazine. It wasn't picturesque in that calculated, tourist-friendly way. The church had a crack along the eastern wall that the diocese kept promising to fix. The single pub, the Crofton Candle, had a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2009 and nobody had ever removed it. The road that ran through the center of the village dipped sharply near the old mill, and every winter someone's car would slide sideways into the shallow drainage ditch, and the same 4 men, always the same 4, would arrive with rope and boots and not a single word of complaint. Thomas loved every broken, stubborn inch of it. He had grown up in the farmhouse at the western edge of the village, a gray stone building that sat just far enough from its neighbors to feel private and just close enough to feel connected. His parents, Nora and Edmund, had farmed it for 40 years. Barley, mostly. Some sheep. A vegetable garden that Nora took more seriously than some people take their careers. Thomas had watched his father walk those fields every morning of his childhood. Had learned, without ever being formally taught, the way you read the sky in February. How the particular shade of pewter along the northern ridge meant rain by afternoon. How the sheep clustered near the lower gate an hour before a serious storm, as if they'd read something in the air that no weather app had caught yet. He had absorbed this village the way you absorb a language spoken around you from infancy, not through study, but through presence. Through simply being there, day after ordinary day, until the place became part of the architecture of who he was. He was, in every way that seemed to matter, a man who belonged. It was a Tuesday in late October when the letter arrived. The mornings had already turned sharp by then, that particular autumn sharpness that feels less like cold and more like clarity, like the air itself had been rinsed clean. Thomas was coming back from the lower field when he saw the postwoman's van pulling away from the gate. He didn't hurry. He never hurried for the post. It was usually seed catalogs or a bill from the agricultural supply depot in Carlisle. He picked up the envelope without looking at it, tucked it under his arm, and went inside to take off his boots. It was only when he sat down at the kitchen table with his too-strong tea that he actually looked at it. The return address was from a solicitor's office in London. He stared at that for a long moment. He didn't know any solicitors. Didn't know anyone in London, not really. His cousin Marina had moved to Hammersmith years ago and they exchanged Christmas messages, and that was the full extent of his relationship with the capital. He opened the envelope slowly. Not with nervousness, exactly. More with the careful attention of someone who senses, without being able to name why, that whatever is inside will require his full concentration. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. He read it once. Then, he set it down on the table. He picked up his mug, realized it had gone cold without him noticing, and set it back down. Then, he read the letter again. I should explain here what the letter said, because it is the engine of everything that came after. The solicitor, a firm called Whitmore and Associates, established 1954 according to the letterhead, was writing to inform Thomas Aldrich that he was the named beneficiary in the estate of one Gerald Pemberton Aldrich, who had died on the 14th of September at a private medical facility in Kensington. Thomas did not immediately recognize the name. That in itself should have told him something. Gerald Pemberton Aldrich had been, the letter explained in that particular careful language solicitors use when they're trying not to say too much in writing, his father's older brother. A man who had left the north of England at the age of 22 and, over the course of the following decades, built a considerable business in commercial property development in London and the southeast. He had never married. He had no children. He had left specific instructions that his estate, and the letter used the word estate the way you'd use it for something genuinely significant, not just a house and a bit of savings, was to pass entirely to Thomas, as the only surviving member of the Aldrich family line. At the bottom of the letter, there was a figure. Thomas looked at that figure for a long time. He had never seen a number that large attached to his own name before. He got up from the table, went to the sink, and stood there looking out the window at the grey October sky and the old stone wall at the bottom of the garden that his father had rebuilt, piece by piece, the summer Thomas was 8 years old. Bramble came and pressed against his leg. He didn't move for a very long time. The first person he told was his mother. Nora had her own cottage now, just at the edge of the village, since Edmund had died 4 years ago. Small place, warm, perpetually smelling of the rosemary she grew in pots along every windowsill. She was 73 and still sharp as a pin, and she had a way of watching you when you spoke that made you feel every word was being weighed carefully before being stored. Thomas drove over that evening and sat at her kitchen table the same way he'd sat at countless kitchen tables his whole life, pulled slightly sideways in the chair, one arm draped over the back of it, not quite formal enough to be a real visit, not casual enough to be just passing through. He handed her the letter. She read it slowly. She read it the way she read everything, thoroughly, without rushing, going back over sections that needed more than one pass. When she finished, she folded it along its original crease and placed it on the table in front of her and said nothing for a moment. "Gerald," she finally said. Not as a question. More like she was pulling something up from a place she'd filed it away a long time ago. "Did you know about him?" Thomas asked. Nora was quiet again. There was a kind of deliberateness to her silence, not evasion, exactly, but the careful silence of someone measuring what to say and how. "Your father knew about him," she said. "They weren't close. Gerald left when your father was still a boy, 12, 13 maybe. Went to London. Sent money back a few times when things were hard, but they didn't stay in contact." "Did Dad ever talk about him?" "Once or twice." She pressed her lips together. "He said Gerald was the sort of man who made his own world and didn't look back at the one he left." "He didn't say it cruelly. Just as a fact." Thomas nodded slowly. "You didn't know he'd died?" he asked. "No." She looked down at the letter. "Nobody told us." That landed somewhere strange, the idea that a man who shared their name, shared their blood, had died in a private room in Kensington, and the only people with any claim to that name hadn't known until a solicitor's letter arrived 4 weeks later. There was something deeply isolating about it. Or maybe, Thomas thought, it was something else entirely. Something more like a closed circle, a life that had been lived entirely away from its origin, and was now, at its very end, turning back to face the place it came from. "What are you going to do?" Nora asked. Thomas looked out her kitchen window. It was dark by now and he could just see the pale outline of the hills against a sky still faintly lit at the horizon. "I don't know yet," he said. "I haven't really taken it in." Nora nodded. She reached across the table and patted his hand once, the compact, practical gesture of a woman who expressed love through presence rather than performance. "There's no hurry," she said. "There never is with the big things." That night, Thomas walked back to the farmhouse rather than driving. He needed the air. He needed the particular feeling of the lane under his boots and the sound of the wind moving through the hedgerows at the field edge. Bramble walked beside him, occasionally disappearing into the darkness at the verge and reappearing without explanation. He thought about Gerald Pemberton Aldrich, this man he had never met, never known existed in any real sense. He tried to construct some version of him from the almost nothing he had, an old man dying in a private facility in Kensington, having spent 50 years building a property empire, having chosen London over whatever came before London. No wife. No children. No close family. Just work, and money, and the long autonomous arc of a life lived entirely on his own terms. Thomas found he couldn't feel the expected things. Not grief, you can't grieve a stranger. Not exactly gratitude either, though he knew at some level that what he'd been given was staggering, was genuinely life-changing in the most literal sense. He couldn't quite feel it yet because it didn't feel real, and it didn't feel real because there was no face attached to it, no voice, no memory, no story. Just a name on a letter and a figure at the bottom of the page. What he felt, more than anything, was a strange unease. Like something had shifted in the foundations of a building he lived in, and the building was still standing, still looked exactly the same, but he could feel through the soles of his feet that something underground had moved. He stood at his gate for a moment before going in. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had, the shape of it against the dark sky, the pale stone, the small lit window of the hall where he always left a lamp on. The smell of the fields. The cold, clean air. He had never questioned this place. He had never needed to. He went inside, made a fresh pot of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the solicitor's letter until the words stopped making sense and started just being shapes. Then, he folded it, put it back in the envelope, and went to bed. He went to London in November. He had been to London before twice, both times briefly. Once as a child on a school trip, which he remembered mostly as a blur of noise and the feeling of his own smallness. Once at 24 for a friend's wedding in Greenwich, which he'd left as soon as was politely possible, standing on a platform at Charing Cross watching the city press in from all directions and feeling a very clear, very quiet instinct that this was not for him. This time was different. He took the early train from Carlisle and watched the landscape change through the window the way it always does on that journey south, from wide and open and belonging to the sky, to gradually crowded, hemmed in, layered with the evidence of human density. More roads. More rooftops. More of everything, stacked up against itself, until by the time the train pulled into Euston the sky above the platform was just a thin strip of grey between buildings. Thomas had the address of the solicitor's office in his coat pocket. He also, tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, had a smaller piece of paper, the address of Gerald's flat in Kensington, which the solicitor had included in the follow-up correspondence. He took the tube. He stood very still in the carriage and watched the other passengers and thought about how none of them looked at each other, how everyone had constructed a careful private bubble of non-acknowledgement that was the only way to maintain any sense of self in so much compressed humanity. He wasn't judging it. He just noticed it, the way you notice the difference in air pressure between a valley and a hill. The solicitor's office was in a quiet street near Marylebone, the kind of quiet that in London means expensive rather than actually peaceful. A narrow Georgian building with polished brass fittings on the door and a receptionist who spoke in a tone that managed to be simultaneously warm and entirely professional. A man named Arthur Whitmore, the grandson of the firm's founder, it turned out, met Thomas in a wood-paneled room on the first floor and walked him through everything with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to people receiving unexpected news and needing time to process it. The estate, in total, was significant. Commercial property. Investment portfolios. A flat in Kensington worth more on its own than Thomas had expected the total to be. Cash accounts. Everything managed, everything documented, everything left in a state of deliberate order. The final act, Thomas couldn't help thinking, of a man who'd controlled his world to the very end. Arthur Whitmore slid documents across the table at careful intervals and explained each one, and Thomas listened and signed where he was told to sign, and asked questions when he had them, and the whole thing took the better part of 3 hours. At the end of it, Arthur Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair and said, with the cautious generosity of a man who'd delivered a lot of life-changing news in this room, "I hope you understand the scale of what you've inherited, Mr. Aldrich. There's no urgency to make any decisions. But, when you're ready to think about next steps, management, liquidation, property, we're here." Thomas nodded. He thanked the man. He shook his hand and retrieved his coat from the rack by the door and went back out into the grey November street. He stood on the pavement for a moment. He was, by any conventional measure, now a wealthy man. The word felt like a coat that didn't quite fit, correct in shape, wrong in some fundamental way he couldn't immediately identify. He almost didn't go to the flat. He stood on the tube platform with the piece of paper in his hand for a full minute before the train arrived, genuinely uncertain. There was a part of him that wanted to simply go back to Euston, get on the train, go home, and process all of this from a safe distance. From Dunmore, where things made sense. But something pulled at him. He couldn't name it precisely, not curiosity, exactly. More like the feeling that not going would be a kind of cowardice. That this man, Gerald, had left him everything, and the least Thomas could do was stand once in the space where he'd lived and try to understand something about who he was. He got on the train. The flat was on the third floor of a red brick mansion block on a quiet street in South Kensington, the kind of building that hummed with understated prosperity, every surface maintained with the quiet authority of significant money. A porter let him up with the key the solicitor had provided. Thomas took the lift. He stood outside the door for a moment, then put the key in the lock. Inside was quiet. Orderly. The solicitor's office had arranged for the flat to be professionally cleaned, so there was none of the particular intimacy of a space still carrying someone's daily residue, no unwashed cup on the counter, no coat over a chair. Just clean, organized rooms furnished with the tasteful restraint of a man who knew what quality looked like and had stopped needing to prove it. Thomas moved through the rooms slowly. The sitting room had full bookshelves, legal history, architecture, several thick biographies, some novels he didn't recognize. A good sound system, clearly well used. A large window overlooking the street, and, at the window, a reading chair turned at a particular angle, not toward the room, but toward the window. Turned toward the outside. The desk in the study was completely clear, which felt deliberate. Either Gerald had cleared it himself before his final hospitalization, or someone had done it afterward. Thomas pulled open one of the desk drawers, not intrusively, just enough, and found it empty except for a single photograph that had been left face down. He picked it up and turned it over. It was a photograph of a farmhouse. Not Thomas's farmhouse specifically, he knew every stone of that building and this was slightly different. But similar. Same gray stone. Same flat northern sky. Same style of gate at the front. Somewhere in the north of England. Somewhere that looked exactly like the landscape Thomas had grown up in. On the back, in handwriting that was old but still firm, Aldrich Farm. 1971, Thomas set it down on the desk very carefully. He sat in the desk chair, in Gerald's study, in a flat that now technically belonged to him, in a city that had always felt like somewhere other people lived, and he looked at that photograph for a long time. Gerald had left. Had built a different life, a magnificent life by most measures, 50 years away from the grey stone and the northern sky. Had never married, never had children, had apparently lived exactly as he intended to live, free, solvent, self-determined, on his own entirely chosen terms. But he had kept this. A photograph of a farmhouse like the one he'd grown up in. Face down in a drawer. Kept, but not displayed. Present, but not acknowledged. There in the dark, like something that couldn't be thrown away and couldn't quite be looked at. Thomas held that thought the way you hold something delicate. Then, he stood up, put the photograph back in the drawer face down, exactly as he'd found it, and went to the window. He looked out at the London street. At the taxis and the bare November trees and the precise, purposeful pedestrians moving along the pavement below. At the sky between the buildings, that compressed, urban sky that gave you just enough to know it was there. He thought about Dunmore. About the farmhouse and the fields and the particular shade of the hills in late afternoon. About Bramble, who was staying with old Pete Hewson from the neighboring farm and would be perfectly fine but would sit by Pete's gate each evening facing the direction Thomas had gone, waiting. He thought about the life Gerald had chosen. And, for the first time, standing in that immaculate, empty flat, he began to truly grapple with the question he hadn't let himself ask yet. Not what will I do with this? But something quieter, more unsettling. What if there was another life waiting for me, and I never knew? He had dinner alone at a small Italian restaurant near the flat, the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and showed no interest in becoming fashionable. He ordered something with pasta and sat at a corner table and ate slowly and listened to the room around him. London in the evening had a different quality than London during the day. Less purposeful. More human. He watched a couple at a nearby table disagree about something with the particular intensity of people who know each other well enough to argue quietly. He watched a young woman eat alone at the counter and read from her phone with the absorbed contentment of someone fully comfortable in their own company. He watched a group of 4 friends arrive, loud with the particular warmth of people who don't see each other as often as they'd like. He thought, people live here. Properly live here. Make lives, make friendships, fall in love, grow old. It isn't a waiting room. It's the actual thing. He knew that intellectually, had always known it. But, sitting there, in Gerald's neighborhood, in Gerald City, the city that had, for 50 years, been enough, something in him shifted. Not desire, exactly. More like a door he'd never noticed opening just a crack. Just enough to let in a draft. He paid the bill and walked back to the flat, where he'd arranged to stay one night, and lay in the unfamiliar darkness of Gerald's guest room listening to the sound of the city different from silence, different from Dunmore's particular fullness, and felt himself suspended between 2 versions of something he hadn't yet named. He went home the next morning. He stood on the Euston platform in the early commuter crowd and watched the announcement board and thought about Gerald, 31 years old and standing at some other station, some other departure point, making some irreversible choice about the direction his life was going to go. Had he hesitated? Had he looked back at the Greystone world he was leaving and felt something pull at him, something like the thing that was pulling at Thomas now, only in the other direction? Or had he been certain? Had it been clean and clear and unambiguous, the way choices only feel in retrospect? Thomas would never know. The train came. He got on it. He found a window seat and watched London give way gradually, then, all at once, to the north. To open sky. To the particular green of fields he recognized not as scenery but as something more fundamental. Something closer to himself. By the time the train passed through the outskirts of Lancaster, he felt the thing in his chest that had been tight since he'd stepped off the train at Euston beginning, very slightly, to ease. He was going home. But, for the first time in 31 years, he was going home really knowing that home was a choice he was making. Not a given. Not a default. A choice. And something about that changed it. Made it both smaller and more precious at the same time, the way knowing something is fragile makes you hold it more carefully. He got back to Dunmore in the early afternoon. Pete Hewson's border collie saw him coming up the lane before Pete did and barked once, and then Bramble was through the gate and running toward him with the specific unself-conscious joy that only dogs manage, pure gladness, no complications attached. Thomas crouched down and let Bramble press against him, muddy paws on his jacket, and felt something in him settle. He didn't sleep the first night, Pete said from the gate, watching this reunion with the straight face of a man who would never admit to finding it moving. Second night he was fine. But, the first night he sat by the range and watched the door. Sorry, Thomas said. Pete waved that away. How was London? Thomas straightened up. Bramble stayed pressed against his leg. Strange, he said. Useful. I'll tell you about it over a pint sometime. Pete nodded. That was enough. He was a Dunmore man, he understood the particular value of sometime, understood it meant when I processed it enough to talk about it without it feeling too raw. Thomas walked back to the farmhouse. He unlocked the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at everything exactly as he'd left it, the coat hook by the door, the too-strong tea he'd abandoned in a mug 2 days ago, the table where he'd read the solicitor's letter. He put the kettle on. He sat down. He thought about a face-down photograph in a London drawer. And, he thought, what exactly are you going to do with this, Thomas? People always expect that kind of money to change a person immediately. Like there's a switch. Like one day you're ordinary and, the next you're transformed, different clothes, different habits, different face in the mirror. That's the story people want, because it's clean and it's legible and it fits on a page neatly. But Thomas didn't change. Not immediately. Not visibly. He went back to the fields. He fixed the section of drystone wall along the eastern boundary that had been slowly losing the argument with gravity since August. He drove to the agricultural supply depot in Carlisle on a Thursday because he needed to, and stood in the hardware aisle for 20 minutes deciding between two grades of steel fencing post with the same concentration he would have applied to any significant purchase. He had the solicitor managing the London estate. He had given Arthur Whitmore a very simple instruction: manage it well, keep me informed, don't require anything from me I don't need to be required for. Whitmore had seemed faintly surprised but accommodated this without comment. He was the kind of professional who had learned not to impose his own expectations about how people should respond to wealth onto people who might simply have different priorities. Thomas didn't touch the money. Not yet. He wasn't sure what that meant, whether it was caution, or disbelief, or something more complicated that he hadn't found the language for yet. It sat there, in accounts in London, fully real in the practical sense, completely abstract in the emotional one. It was Nora who asked the real question. She asked it in December, 6 weeks after the letter had arrived. Thomas had come to her cottage for Sunday lunch: roast lamb, carrots from the garden, the slightly too heavy gravy she'd made the exact same way his entire life, and they'd eaten mostly in comfortable silence, the way people eat who have known each other so long that silence is a form of communication in its own right. Afterward, over tea, she set her mug down and looked at him directly. "Are you happy here, Thomas?" He looked up. "What?" "Here. Dunmore. The farm." She said it plainly, without drama, but he could hear underneath it the very specific quality of a question that has been waiting a long time to be asked. "Are you happy here, or are you here because you never thought of anywhere else?" He felt the question land in him the way certain questions do, not painfully, but with weight. With the weight of truth that has been deferred. He didn't answer immediately. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the steam rising from it and tried to be honest. "I love it here," he said. "You know I do." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. Nora Aldrich had a face that had been weathered by 60 years of northern English weather into something that looked like the stone of the walls around the village, strong, textured, holding its shape against whatever came at it. She was looking at him now with the particular expression he recognized from childhood, the expression that meant "I know you well enough to know when you're giving me the easy answer." He exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I knew. I've always thought I knew exactly what this was and what it meant and that it was enough." He paused. "But, since the letter, I keep thinking about Gerald. About what he chose. And I keep asking myself whether I chose this, or whether it just happened to me." Nora nodded slowly. She didn't offer comfort immediately. She let the question sit in the room between them the way she'd let difficult things sit his whole life, with respect for their difficulty, with the conviction that rushing past them was worse than sitting with them. "You know," she said eventually, "your father asked himself that question too. Different circumstances. But the same question." Thomas looked at her, surprised. "Edmund?" He had a chance to leave when he was 26. There was a position in Edinburgh, an agricultural management company, good money, real advancement. He turned it down. "I didn't know that. You weren't born yet." Nora wrapped her own hands around her mug. "He never regretted it. But he always knew he'd chosen it, he didn't let himself forget that. He said once that the day he stopped knowing he'd made a choice was the day he'd start resenting the life he was living." She looked at Thomas steadily. "I think he was right about that." Thomas sat with that for a moment. "Gerald chose the other direction," he said. "Yes. And ended up alone in a flat in Kensington with a face-down photograph." Nora was quiet. "Maybe," she said carefully. "Or maybe he ended up with exactly what he wanted. We don't know enough to judge that." She paused. "He kept the photograph, though. He kept it face down. He kept it." Thomas looked out the window. The December afternoon was already going dark, that particular early darkness of the northern winter that felt less like an ending and more like the land pulling its coat tighter around itself. "What are you going to do?" Nora asked again. The same question she'd asked 6 weeks ago, but different now, heavier, more specific. Thomas turned back to her. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to figure out whether I actually want to stay. Not whether I love it, not whether I'm comfortable here. Whether I want this. Whether I would choose it." He paused. "Because I think I've been living here as if it was inevitable. And it isn't. It never was." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then, she nodded once, the small, precise nod of a woman who had been waiting for her son to say something true. He stayed. But the staying was different after that. In January, he made a decision about the London flat. He didn't sell it immediately. Arthur Whitmore advised against that for tax reasons, and Thomas trusted the man's judgment on London things. But he arranged for it to be let, properly managed, someone living in it, the rooms being used rather than sitting preserved in their orderly vacancy like a museum of a life that had already ended. The money, when it became real to him, when the first quarterly statement came through from Whitmore's end, he sat with it and actually absorbed what it meant. He used carefully. Not lavishly. More like someone who had been handed a tool they hadn't previously had access to and was only slowly working out what problems it might solve. He repaired the farmhouse properly, not renovated, not transformed, just repaired. The roof, which had been a source of low-level anxiety for 3 years. The outbuilding that had been losing the battle with damp since Edmund's last serious intervention a decade ago. He had the eastern field drained and reseeded. He bought a second-hand Land Rover that was better than the one he'd been nursing along since before his father died. Small things. Practical things. Things that didn't change the shape of the life but made it sturdier. People in Dunmore noticed, of course. Villages notice everything, not maliciously, just with the attentive observation of communities that have always monitored each other's weather as a matter of survival. There was some talk. There was, inevitably, some speculation about what Thomas Aldrich had apparently come into and what he was going to do with it. He didn't explain himself. He wasn't secretive, but he wasn't explanatory either. He was who he'd always been, the man at the edge of the field at dusk, the one who arrived at the pub on a Friday with mud still on his jacket, the one who showed up with rope and boots when someone's car went into the drainage ditch. He was just that man, now, with a different foundation under him. It was Pete Hewson who noticed the real change. Pete had been Thomas's neighbor, technically, his entire life. Their properties shared a long boundary wall, and they had the kind of friendship that existed almost entirely in side-by-side activity rather than direct conversation. They didn't talk about feelings. They talked about fields and weather and the price of barley and the relative merits of different breeds of working dog. But Pete had known Thomas since Thomas was 7 years old, and he had a farmer's eye for the difference between a creature that is simply going through its patterns and one that has made a genuine accommodation with its circumstances. He mentioned it once, just obliquely, in the way he mentioned things. They were repairing the boundary wall together one Saturday in late February, the kind of work that occupies your hands and leaves your mind free, and Pete straightened up and looked across the field toward the hills and said, without specifically leading into it, "You seem different." Thomas set down the stone he was holding. Different how? Pete considered. He had the slow, considered speech of a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. "More like yourself," he said finally. Thomas thought about that for a moment. That's a strange thing to say. Maybe. Pete picked up his next stone. But it's what I see. They went back to the wall. The wind came off the hills with the particular edge of late February, almost done being winter, not quite ready to be spring. A in-between feeling. Transitional. Thomas thought, more like yourself. He thought about the drawer in Gerald's study. The photograph face down. The clean, orderly flat in Kensington, tasteful and controlled and utterly silent. He thought about Bramble pressed against his leg at the gate. He thought about his father rebuilding this very wall section, stone by stone, the summer Thomas was 8, showing him without words how things that seem broken can be remade if you understand how they fit together. He picked up a stone and found its place in the wall. There was a night in March, one of those first real spring nights, mild enough to be outside without a serious coat, the stars very clear, when Thomas stood at the back of his field as he sometimes did and looked at the hills and thought about the question his mother had asked. Are you happy here, or are you here because you never thought of anywhere else? He had an answer now. Not the one he'd started with, not the easy one. A harder one, a realer one. He was here because he had thought of somewhere else, had stood in the middle of that somewhere else, had looked at it clearly, had felt the draft through the door that had opened a crack. He had understood, properly, for the first time, that his life was not inevitable. That it was constructed. That it had been assembled, piece by piece, from choices, some conscious, some not, and that it could have been assembled differently. And, having understood that, he had chosen it. Not because he couldn't imagine anything else. Not because he was afraid of the alternative, or because the alternative was bad, or because London and the flat and Gerald's world held nothing of value. But because this was his. Not in the passive sense, not in the sense of belonging to something by default, the way you belong to a country simply by being born in it. In the active sense. He had looked at it from the outside, which is the only way to really see something, and he had come back in. Bramble was sitting beside him, doing the dog thing, staring at the same hills, for reasons entirely his own. Thomas looked at the shape of the farmhouse against the dark sky. At the lit window of the kitchen where he'd left the light on. He thought about Gerald one more time. About that photograph. He hoped, quietly, that Gerald's life had been what he wanted it to be. He hoped the flat and the city and the 50 years of autonomous living had filled something that needed filling. He hoped Gerald had stood at his own window, in his own late evening moments, and felt what Thomas was feeling now, the settled, chosen quality of a life genuinely inhabited rather than merely endured. He thought, maybe keeping the photograph face down wasn't regret. Maybe it was just honoring the thing he'd left without letting it undo the life he'd built. Maybe that was its own kind of wisdom. He didn't know. He would never know. But, standing there in the March dark, with Bramble beside him and the hills ahead and the lit kitchen at his back, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected to feel when all this started. He felt grateful. Not for the money, though that was real and he was honest enough to acknowledge it. Grateful for the letter, for the summons south, for the London office and Gerald's orderly flat and the draft through the cracked open door. Grateful for the question he'd been forced to ask. For the answer he'd been forced to find. He had been sleepwalking through a life he loved. And the strange bequest of a man he'd never met had woken him up enough to choose it. That was something. That was, maybe, everything. The following September, a year almost to the day after Gerald Pemberton Aldrich died in a private medical facility in Kensington, Thomas drove to the village church on a Tuesday morning, which was not something he typically did outside of Christmas and funerals. He sat in a pew near the back, in the quiet, and looked at the cracked eastern wall that the diocese kept promising to fix. He wasn't religious in any formal sense. He wasn't sure exactly why he'd come. Partly, maybe, to mark the anniversary in some way that felt private and unperformative. Partly to think about Gerald in a space that had been thinking about people's endings for centuries and had developed, over that time, a certain equanimity about it. He sat there for about 20 minutes. When he left, he stood for a moment outside in the September morning, the air bright and sharp, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive not from any dramatic cause but just because the light is doing something especially good and the air tastes exactly right, and he looked at the village. At the road with its familiar dip near the old mill. At the Crofton candle with its broken jukebox and its reliable warmth. At the houses and the fences and the stone walls and the hills behind everything, permanent and patient and completely indifferent to human drama. He thought, I know this place. Not just know it the way you know somewhere you've been long enough. Know it the way you know a language you've spoken from birth in your bones, beneath language itself, beneath consciousness. The way a place can be so deep inside you that distinguishing between the place and yourself becomes genuinely difficult. He thought about Gerald keeping the photograph. He thought, I understand that now. I would keep a photograph too. But he didn't have to. Because he was still here. The photograph and the original were the same thing. He was living inside the thing Gerald had only been able to hold face down in a drawer, this gray, imperfect, entirely sufficient northern world. He pulled his coat closer and walked down the village road toward home. Bramble appeared from somewhere, he had a talent for appearing from somewhere, and fell into step beside him without any particular fuss, the way he always did, as if they had simply resumed a conversation briefly interrupted. The hills were exactly where they always were. The sky was doing that thing it does in September, pale and enormous and giving nothing away. Thomas walked home. He walked home the way a man walks when he knows it is home, not hurrying, not looking back, not anywhere else in his mind except exactly here. And the village received him the way it always had, without ceremony, without comment, without anything as excessive as welcome. Just the familiar road, and the familiar walls, and the familiar silence that was never empty. The silence of a place that has been alive for centuries, and keeps being alive, and asks for nothing more than to be inhabited by people who are paying enough attention to notice. Thomas had learned, finally, how to pay that kind of attention. He walked home. There are men who leave the place they come from and build worlds elsewhere, and die having made their peace with the distance. And there are men who stay, and learn, too late or just in time, that staying is not the same as never leaving. Thomas Aldrich called a small village home. He had always called it home. He just didn't know, until the year he almost left, that he was calling it and that it was answering.